Chapter 1. Most people believe they are building assets. In reality, they are building income arrangements that depend on their continued presence. The distinction is not cosmetic. It determines whether income can outlive the person who created it, or whether it collapses the moment attention is withdrawn. In economic terms, an asset is not defined by the fact that it produces money. It is defined by whether it can continue to do so independently of its owner's ongoing labor. Any system that requires regular personal input in order to remain functional is not an asset, even if it temporarily appears profitable. It is a labor system with delayed compensation. This misunderstanding explains why so many modern wealth strategies quietly fail. Content-based businesses, personal brands, service agencies, and many forms of small-scale real estate investing are commonly described as passive. Structurally, they are not. They are stabilized by continuous human intervention. Marketing must be refreshed, platforms must be monitored, tenants must be managed, algorithms must be appeased, and reputations must be maintained. When that intervention stops, income does not merely pause. It begins to weaken, fragment, and ultimately disappear. Income systems are not static objects. They exist within environments that are constantly changing. Markets evolve, technologies replace one another, competitors emerge, regulations shift, and consumer behavior adapts. Time applies pressure to every economic structure. This pressure does not cause sudden collapse in most cases. It causes slow, predictable loss of relevance, efficiency, and margin. The proper term for this process is deterioration. It is not a failure of effort. It is a natural consequence of time acting on any system that lacks internal renewal. A genuine asset is designed with mechanisms that counter this deterioration. It does not depend on the ongoing attention of its creator to remain functional. Instead, it contains structures that renew demand, maintain participation, or reinforce its own relevance. These structures allow the asset to persist even as its environment changes. Without them, every income system eventually becomes obsolete, no matter how successful it once appeared. The purpose of this book is not to promote techniques or trends. It is to explain how durable income systems are engineered, why they survive, and how personal skill can be converted into structures that do not require continuous personal involvement. What follows will not focus on how to make money quickly, but on how to design systems that remain economically alive when you step away. An asset is not defined by what it earns. It is defined by whether it can survive you. Chapter 2. Money does not move randomly. It follows predictable structural paths that can be studied, anticipated, and deliberately positioned around. People fail to build lasting income not because they lack effort or intelligence, but because they place themselves in parts of the economic landscape where money cannot remain concentrated for long. They attempt to hold water in open hands and then wonder why it keeps leaking away. Every market contains zones of high economic gravity and zones of rapid dispersion. In high-gravity zones, money pools, circulates repeatedly, and compounds. In low-gravity zones, money passes through quickly, never staying long enough to accumulate. Labor markets, freelancing, content creation, and most small online ventures exist almost entirely in low-gravity zones. They reward activity, but they do not retain value. Income earned in these areas must be constantly replaced because it is structurally unable to remain. Economic gravity is created by ownership, not activity. Ownership of systems, standards, infrastructure, contracts, and legal claims produces gravitational pull. These structures cause money to return repeatedly to the same node rather than flowing onward. Rent, licensing, tolls, subscriptions, royalties, transaction fees, and financial interest are not different income ideas. They are manifestations of the same structural principle, control over a pathway that money must pass through. This is why financial independence does not come from doing more work. It comes from repositioning oneself closer to these gravitational centers. When you own the channel through which value must move, you do not need to chase money. It arrives because the system itself directs flow toward you. Compounding is often described as a mathematical phenomenon, but in practice, it is a structural one. Money compounds when it is retained within a reinforcing loop instead of leaking outward. If profits are constantly extracted for consumption or must be reinvested merely to prevent decline, true compounding never occurs. The system remains fragile and dependent on continuous personal effort. Durable assets are engineered around closed or semi-closed loops. They capture value, redistribute a portion of it to maintain participation, and return the remainder to the owner. Over time, these loops strengthen their own relevance by becoming embedded in habits, contracts, infrastructure, or regulations. This embedding is what creates longevity. It is not growth that makes an asset durable. It is structural integration. Most people attempt to build income by inserting themselves into flows that they do not control. They become replaceable participants inside systems owned by others. Even when income appears strong, it is precarious because control remains elsewhere. Real assets are not positions within systems. They are systems. The practical implication is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Financial stability is not created by effort, talent, or visibility. It is created by owning mechanisms that direct the movement of money. Everything else is a temporary arrangement. Chapter 3. The most important distinction in long-term wealth building is not between effort and laziness, intelligence and ignorance, or risk and safety. It is the distinction between time leverage and structural leverage. Most people rely almost entirely on time. Durable assets are built on structure. Time leverage is simple. You exchange hours, attention, or availability for money. The moment your time stops being available, income stops as well. Even when time leverage is multiplied through delegation, outsourcing, or automation, it remains fundamentally tied to continued supervision. Someone must still manage, approve, monitor, and adapt. The system is not independent. It is merely stretched. Structural leverage is different. It does not multiply your hours. It removes your hours from the income equation. Income continues because the system itself contains mechanisms that renew participation, enforce payments, and maintain relevance. The difference is not in scale, but in architecture. Most businesses that claim to be passive are extended time leverage systems. An online course still requires marketing, platform maintenance, content updates, and customer support. A rental portfolio still requires tenant management, repairs, financing oversight, and legal compliance. A media brand still requires attention, content production, and algorithmic adaptation. These systems can be profitable, but they are fragile. Their income is conditional on ongoing human input. People mistake delegation for independence. Hiring staff does not convert a time-leveraged system into a structural asset. It simply replaces your hours with someone else's. The system still decays when oversight weakens. True structural leverage exists only when participation and payment are enforced by the system itself rather than by the owner's attention. Durable assets are built on enforceable pathways. These pathways can be legal, contractual, infrastructural, or behavioral. A legal pathway enforces payment through ownership rights, licenses, patents, or exclusive claims. A contractual pathway enforces payment through binding agreements that require renewal, penalties, or continued compliance. An infrastructural pathway enforces payment by controlling access to physical or digital networks that others must use. A behavioral pathway enforces payment by embedding itself into habit, routine, or operational necessity. The critical feature of these pathways is that they continue functioning even when the original builder is absent. They do not require persuasion, monitoring, or personal presence. They function because they are structurally unavoidable for participants who wish to continue receiving value. Most income strategies fail because they rely on persuasion rather than enforcement. Marketing must constantly convince new participants. Branding must constantly maintain attention. Promotions must constantly replace lost interest. These systems are exposed to rapid decay because persuasion is the weakest form of economic control. It is unstable, expensive, and easily disrupted. Structural leverage replaces persuasion with inevitability. Participants remain not because they are excited, but because the system is integrated into their operations, habits, or legal obligations. This is why banks, utilities, payment processors, software infrastructure providers, landlords of essential commercial property, and owners of licensing frameworks accumulate durable wealth. They do not rely on constant persuasion. They rely on structural position. Time-leveraged systems feel faster in the beginning. They reward visible effort. They provide early feedback. They can generate income quickly. Structural systems are slower to build, more complex to design, and less immediately rewarding. Their early stages feel inefficient and unproductive. This is why most people abandon them. They mistake slow compounding for failure. However, once a structural system reaches self-renewal, the economic behavior changes completely. Income becomes predictable. Cash flow stabilizes. Participation persists. The owner's personal involvement can be reduced without triggering collapse. This is the point at which a system becomes an asset rather than a job. The psychological difficulty lies in delayed gratification. Time-leveraged income provides immediate validation. Structural leverage often feels invisible in its early stages. Its benefits accumulate quietly, without dramatic milestones. This mismatch causes people to underestimate the value of structural positioning and overestimate the importance of visible activity. Long-term financial independence is therefore not a question of how hard you work or how skilled you become. It is a question of where you place yourself within economic pathways. If you remain inside systems owned by others, you will always be subject to their rules, their margins, and their decay. If you own pathways that others must use, you accumulate economic gravity. Chapter 4. All income systems decay unless they are deliberately designed to counter time. The design of a renewable income system is therefore not about finding a profitable activity. It is about embedding mechanisms that replace what time erodes. Most people attempt to stabilize income by adding effort. They work harder, market more aggressively, update products more frequently, and remain personally involved in operations. These actions may slow decline, but they do not change the underlying structure. They treat symptoms rather than causes. The system remains fragile because its ability to function is still tied to continuous human input. A renewable income architecture is built around self-reinforcing loops. These loops perform three functions. They bring participants into the system, they keep participants engaged, and they direct recurring value back to the owner. If any one of these functions depends on personal effort rather than structure, the system remains exposed to decay. The simplest form of renewal is contractual. Subscriptions, memberships, leases, service agreements, and licensing arrangements renew because participants are bound by formal obligations. As long as value is delivered at an acceptable baseline, renewal occurs automatically. The owner does not need to persuade participants each cycle. The system itself enforces continuity. A second form of renewal is infrastructural. When a system becomes embedded in daily operations, workflows, or supply chains, it gains structural protection. Participants continue not because of preference, but because replacement would be costly, disruptive, or risky. This form of renewal is common in enterprise software, logistics platforms, payment systems, and utilities. The system becomes part of how other systems function. A third form of renewal is behavioral. Here, continuation is enforced by habit, routine, or psychological reliance. While less formally binding than contracts or infrastructure, behavioral renewal can be extremely durable when integrated into daily life. Financial tools, communication platforms, learning systems, and workflow management environments often rely on this mechanism. The most durable income systems combine more than one renewal mechanism. Contractual obligations reinforce behavioral habits. Infrastructural embedding reinforces contractual continuity. The overlapping of these mechanisms creates redundancy. If one weakens, others maintain stability. Most passive income strategies fail because they rely primarily on novelty. Novelty creates initial attention but offers no structural protection. As soon as the novelty fades, the system must be propped up by marketing, discounts, or personal involvement. Income becomes volatile and short-lived. Renewable architectures, by contrast, do not require constant stimulation. They rely on continuity rather than excitement. Their design prioritizes stability, predictability, and integration over rapid growth. Growth may occur, but it is not the foundation of durability. Designing such systems requires thinking in terms of pathways rather than products. Instead of asking what you can sell, the correct question is what ongoing pathway you can own. The product is simply the vehicle through which the pathway is accessed. The asset is the pathway itself. Chapter 5. The difference between owning an asset and merely participating in someone else's system is the difference between structural independence and structural dependency. Most people who believe they are building assets are, in reality, operating inside platforms they do not control. Their income exists at the discretion of rules, algorithms, fee structures, and policies set by other entities. Platforms offer convenience, distribution, and access to markets. They also impose fragility. When a system's visibility, payment processing, customer access, or legal framework is controlled externally, the income derived from it is conditional. It can be reduced, redirected, or eliminated without the owner's consent. This risk is not theoretical. It is structural. Many online businesses, content brands, and digital product ventures appear to be assets because they generate revenue without daily manual labor. In practice, they remain dependent on external channels for traffic, discovery, and transaction processing. A change in platform policy, algorithm behavior, pricing structure, or compliance requirements can instantly alter their economics. The system may continue to function, but the owner no longer controls the terms. Structural independence requires ownership of the core pathway through which value moves. This does not necessarily mean building everything from scratch. It means ensuring that no single external gatekeeper can unilaterally disrupt the system's ability to acquire, retain, and monetize participants. Durable income systems therefore prioritize control over three elements: access, continuity, and pricing. Access refers to the ability to reach participants without relying on a single intermediary. Continuity refers to the ability to maintain relationships and recurring interactions independently of third-party rules. Pricing refers to the ability to set and adjust economic terms without imposed ceilings or forced discounts. Systems that fail to secure control over these elements remain exposed. They may be profitable, but they are not durable. Their longevity depends on external goodwill rather than structural position. This is why ownership of infrastructure, legal frameworks, proprietary standards, and direct contractual relationships forms the foundation of long-term financial stability. These structures convert participation into obligation and convenience into dependency. They move a system from being optional to being integrated. The strategic objective is not to avoid platforms entirely. It is to use platforms as acquisition channels while migrating relationships into owned systems. The asset is not the traffic. The asset is the pathway that remains when the traffic source changes. Chapter 6. Compounding is widely described as a financial effect, but in durable income systems it is primarily a structural one. Money compounds only when it is captured, retained, and reinvested inside a closed or semi-closed loop that grows more capable with each cycle. Without such a loop, growth is temporary and decay is inevitable. Most income systems leak. Revenue enters, but it immediately exits through marketing expenses, platform fees, labor costs, customer churn, regulatory friction, and operational inefficiencies. The owner is forced to continuously refill the system with effort, capital, or attention just to maintain its previous level. From the outside, these systems can appear successful. From a structural perspective, they are unstable. They do not compound, they consume. A self-compounding system is designed to reduce leakage and increase internal reinforcement over time. It does not merely generate profit. It strengthens its own position with every cycle. Each round of participation makes the next round easier, cheaper, and more defensible. The system accumulates economic gravity rather than merely accumulating cash. This begins with understanding that compounding is not created by growth alone. Growth without reinforcement produces fragility. Rapid user acquisition, aggressive expansion, and inflated revenue figures often conceal structural weakness. If each additional participant increases operating complexity faster than it increases system stability, the system becomes harder to maintain rather than easier. True compounding produces simplification. The system becomes more efficient, more predictable, and more resistant to disruption as it grows. A self-compounding architecture is built around 3 interlocking loops: a value loop, a retention loop, and a reinforcement loop. These loops are not marketing constructs. They are structural pathways that determine whether participation strengthens or weakens the system over time. The value loop defines how participants receive benefit. It must be consistent, reliable, and clearly bounded. Participants must understand what they are receiving, how often, and under what conditions. Ambiguity increases friction and reduces trust. Trust is not a soft concept in durable systems. It is an operational variable. Systems with high trust require less persuasion, fewer incentives, and lower marketing spend to maintain participation. The retention loop defines why participants remain. This is where most systems fail. Retention is not created by satisfaction alone. It is created by integration. When a system becomes embedded into workflows, routines, or contractual obligations, departure becomes costly. Cost does not only mean money. It includes time, risk, inconvenience, and loss of continuity. The higher the perceived cost of leaving, the more stable the system becomes. The reinforcement loop defines how the system strengthens itself as it operates. This loop is what transforms revenue into durability. Reinforcement can take many forms. It can be data accumulation that improves performance, network effects that increase value with each additional participant, legal protection that expands coverage, infrastructure investment that lowers marginal cost, or brand integration that increases habitual use. The specific form is less important than the structural effect. Each cycle must make the system harder to replace. Most systems never develop a reinforcement loop. They generate revenue, distribute it, and then return to the starting position. They feel busy, but remain economically stationary. Without reinforcement, there is no compounding. There is only repetition. Self-compounding systems are intentionally conservative in what they optimize. They prioritize stability over novelty, predictability over excitement, and retention over expansion. This makes them appear slow in the early stages. Their growth curves are flatter, their revenue increases less dramatic, and their visibility lower. This causes them to be underestimated, copied poorly, or ignored entirely. Over time, however, their structural advantages accumulate quietly and persistently. The role of reinvestment is often misunderstood. Reinvestment is not about pouring money back into marketing or headcount. It is about strengthening the loops that make the system more defensible. If reinvestment does not reduce churn, lower marginal costs, increase switching friction, or deepen integration, it does not contribute to compounding. It merely fuels activity. Consider subscription, infrastructures, transaction clearing systems, licensing frameworks, and embedded financial services. Their reinforcement loops are obvious. Each additional participant increases data density, operational familiarity, and integration complexity. Over time, the cost of replacement becomes prohibitive. The system transitions from being a choice to being an assumption. This is why the most durable assets are often invisible. They do not dominate attention. They dominate processes. They are not talked about in trends. They are embedded in routines. A key design principle of self-compounding systems is redundancy. Redundancy does not mean inefficiency. It means overlapping mechanisms that protect continuity. Multiple renewal mechanisms, multiple access pathways, and multiple revenue streams increase resilience. If one weakens, others maintain stability. Redundancy transforms risk from existential to manageable. Another essential principle is gradual lock-in. Lock-in is not created through coercion. It is created through cumulative convenience and integration. The longer participants remain, the more the system becomes part of their normal operations. Over time, leaving feels unnecessary, risky, or wasteful. This psychological and operational integration is what turns users into infrastructure. Systems that achieve this stage are no longer selling a product. They are maintaining a relationship that participants do not wish to replace. The economic power of such systems is not in pricing leverage alone. It is in stability. The most common mistake made by entrepreneurs attempting to build durable assets is premature scaling. They attempt to grow before reinforcement loops are in place. They acquire users faster than they can integrate them. This creates churn, operational stress, and structural weakness. The system becomes loud but fragile. When growth slows, decay accelerates. A durable system grows only as fast as its reinforcement mechanisms can absorb. It expands carefully, integrating each new participant into the loops that increase stability. Growth is treated as a structural process, not a marketing objective. Another common mistake is over-optimizing revenue extraction. Excessive monetization weakens retention and increases churn. It converts a potentially compounding system into a consumptive one. Durable systems prioritize lifetime participation over short-term extraction. They earn less per cycle, but accumulate more cycles. The goal is not to maximize profit per transaction. It is to maximize the number of transactions that occur over the lifetime of the relationship. Stability beats intensity. This is why many of the most enduring businesses appear unremarkable. Their pricing is modest. Their growth is steady. Their visibility is low, yet they persist for decades, accumulating structural advantage and economic gravity that newer, louder systems cannot replicate. In practical terms, Building a self-compounding system requires patience, restraint, and architectural discipline. It requires designing for continuity rather than speed, for integration rather than reach, and for reinforcement rather than attention. By the time a system feels obviously powerful, its compounding mechanisms have already been operating quietly for years. Its advantage is no longer easily copied. Its position is no longer easily challenged. Chapter 7: Longevity Engineering. Durability is not a side effect of success. It is an engineering discipline. Most income systems that collapse do not fail because they were unprofitable. They fail because they were never designed to survive environmental change. Their builders mistake early success for structural soundness and then assume that continuation is natural. It is not. Continuation must be designed. Markets do not preserve what once worked. They replace it. Every economic environment is defined by forces that change over time: technology, regulation, cost structures, competition, and behavior. These forces are not random. They move predictably in certain directions. Technology becomes cheaper and more powerful. Regulations accumulate. Competition increases. Margins compress. Attention fragments. Consumers become more selective and less loyal. These pressures act simultaneously and continuously. Any system that cannot absorb these pressures begins to lose relevance long before revenue visibly declines. By the time financial deterioration is obvious, structural deterioration has usually been underway for years. Longevity engineering begins with acknowledging that decay is the default state. Persistence is an achievement, not a baseline. A durable system is therefore not one that merely performs well in its current environment. It is one that can maintain structural relevance as its environment shifts. This requires designing for adaptation, redundancy, and repositioning from the beginning. The first principle of longevity is environmental independence. The more a system depends on a single market condition, platform, technology, or regulatory structure, the shorter its lifespan. Single dependency systems are brittle. They can perform extremely well for a period and then fail suddenly when a single assumption changes. A system that depends entirely on one traffic source, one pricing model, one platform, one legal classification, or one customer segment is not an asset. It is a temporary configuration. Longevity engineering therefore begins with reducing single-point dependencies. This does not mean building complexity for its own sake. It means identifying which assumptions would collapse the system if they changed, and deliberately weakening those dependencies. For example, a system that relies on a single platform for customer acquisition must build parallel access pathways. A system that relies on a single pricing model must test alternative structures. A system that relies on a narrow customer profile must broaden its integration into adjacent segments. Each additional pathway does not merely increase reach. It increases survivability. The second principle of longevity is replacement resistance. Systems are not destroyed only by competitors. They are replaced by superior convenience, lower friction, or better integration. Most people assume that price is the main threat. It is not. Friction is. A cheaper system can be ignored. A more convenient system cannot. Replacement resistance is created by integration depth. The deeper a system is embedded into workflows, habits, data, contracts, or infrastructure, the harder it becomes to remove. Removal becomes risky, costly, and disruptive. Over time, the system becomes part of normal operations rather than a discretionary tool. This is why enterprise software, accounting platforms, payment rails, compliance frameworks, and logistics systems are so durable. They are not exciting. They are integrated. Their presence is assumed rather than evaluated. A system that requires constant reevaluation by users is fragile. A system that becomes part of routine is resilient. The third principle of longevity is evolutionary capacity. Durable systems are not static. They are designed to change without collapsing. They can alter features, pricing, positioning, and delivery mechanisms while preserving continuity of participation. This requires separation between the system's core function and its surface implementation. The core must remain stable while the surface evolves. Without this separation, any significant change becomes destructive. For example, a licensing framework can change delivery formats, interfaces, or support models while maintaining the same contractual core. A payment network can upgrade technology while preserving account relationships. A knowledge system can evolve content while maintaining certification or accreditation structures. Systems that lack this separation become trapped. They cannot evolve without alienating participants. They stagnate and are eventually replaced. The fourth principle of longevity is regulatory resilience. Regulations accumulate. They rarely disappear. Over time, compliance burdens increase, reporting requirements expand, and classification boundaries shift. Systems that treat regulation as an external nuisance are eventually crushed by it. Durable systems design compliance into their architecture. They anticipate regulatory expansion. They build documentation, auditability, and adaptability into their operations. Over time, regulation becomes a moat rather than a threat. New entrants struggle to comply, while established systems absorb the burden with marginal cost. This is why financial infrastructure, healthcare platforms, and utilities become more dominant over time rather than less. Regulation does not weaken them. It protects them. The fifth principle of longevity is cost curve dominance. Over time, margins compress. New entrants copy features and undercut pricing. Durable systems must therefore operate on declining marginal cost curves. Each additional participant must be cheaper to serve than the last. Without this property, growth becomes increasingly expensive and eventually unviable. Declining marginal costs are created by automation, standardization, data reuse, and infrastructure leverage. Systems that remain labor-intensive at scale cannot survive competitive pressure. A system that becomes easier to operate as it grows is structurally advantaged. A system that becomes harder to operate as it grows is structurally doomed. Longevity engineering is therefore not about adding features or chasing trends. It is about designing systems that become more resilient, more efficient, and more integrated as time passes. Longevity does not occur by accident. Most income systems fail silently long before their collapse becomes obvious. Their decay begins at the structural level and moves outward toward revenue, reputation, and visibility. Understanding these failure modes is essential for designing assets that endure. The first failure mode is overdependence on a single participant. This could be a key customer, a single traffic source, or one critical employee. If that participant leaves, stops performing, or changes their behavior, the system weakens instantly. Many small businesses and digital ventures operate entirely on this model without realizing it. Revenue may appear stable, but it is a fragile illusion. Longevity engineering requires distributing dependency across multiple nodes to reduce systemic risk. The second failure mode is inadequate renewal mechanisms. Systems that rely on novelty, persuasion, or continuous human effort are inherently temporary. They generate bursts of activity, but no persistence. Once the novelty fades or attention is diverted elsewhere, participation declines. Durable systems replace attention with inevitability, behavioral loops, contractual obligations, infrastructure integration, or regulatory positioning. Designing multiple, overlapping renewal mechanisms transforms an unstable system into one capable of self-maintenance. The third failure mode is surface dependence on external platforms. Many digital ventures rely heavily on social media, marketplaces, app stores, or algorithm-driven traffic. While these platforms accelerate growth, they also expose the system to unilateral changes. Algorithms shift, policies tighten, fees increase, or visibility collapses. Any income model built on external control remains precarious. True longevity comes from migrating the system into owned channels while using platforms only as acquisition pipelines. The fourth failure mode is rigid architecture. Systems designed for a single configuration, pricing model, interface, or delivery method lack the ability to adapt. When the environment changes, new technology, new competitors, evolving consumer behavior, rigid systems cannot evolve without alienating participants. Longevity engineering introduces modularity. The core functions remain stable, while peripheral layers can change to maintain relevance. The fifth failure mode is short-term extraction over long-term stability. Many businesses prioritize immediate revenue at the expense of participation continuity. Excessive monetization, aggressive upselling, or high friction for continued engagement may increase short-term cash flow, but erode the system's longevity. Durable systems optimize for lifetime engagement and compounding behavior, not isolated transactions. The sixth failure mode is ignorance of environmental entropy. All markets and systems naturally evolve. Competitors emerge, costs increase, attention fragments, regulations accumulate, and consumer preferences shift. Systems that ignore these forces are doomed to gradual decay. Longevity engineering treats these pressures as constants. It designs resilience into the architecture rather than reacting when failure becomes imminent. The seventh failure mode is overcomplexity without reinforcement. Some designers assume that adding features, processes, or integrations will automatically increase stability. In reality, complexity without reinforcement introduces friction, increases operational costs, and raises the risk of collapse. Durable systems are simple where simplicity matters, but structurally sophisticated where stability requires it. Each element exists to strengthen the system's reinforcement loops, not to impress or inflate perceived value. To counter these failure modes, longevity engineering employs 5 strategic principles simultaneously: diversification, redundancy, modularity, integration, and adaptive reinforcement. Diversification spreads dependency across participants, channels, and geographies. Redundancy overlaps renewal mechanisms, so failure in one path does not collapse the system. Modularity separates the core function from peripheral elements, allowing evolution without disruption. Integration embeds the system into the participants' operations, routines, or obligations. Adaptive reinforcement strengthens the system with each cycle, converting participation into stability and growth. Designing for longevity also requires understanding the difference between absolute survivability and competitive durability. Absolute survivability is impossible. No system lasts forever. Even governments, financial institutions, and major corporations eventually change or dissolve. Competitive durability, however, ensures the system remains dominant or irreplaceable within its environment long enough to achieve economic goals, even as the environment evolves. The measure of a system's longevity is not how large it is at any point in time, but how effectively it maintains relevance, participation, and revenue in the face of change. This requires metrics that go beyond cash flow or short-term growth. Longevity metrics focus on participant retention, cost efficiency, integration depth, dependency dispersion, and reinforcement strength. Systems that score highly on these metrics are structurally durable, Those that do not are transient. Technology adds another layer to longevity engineering. Systems designed without anticipating technological change are vulnerable to obsolescence. Durable systems either control technology, owning platforms, standards, or infrastructure, or design for easy adaptation. Proprietary control creates defensibility, while modular design enables survival when control is impossible. Many ventures fail not because they are poorly executed today, but because they cannot accommodate the technological landscape of tomorrow. Another overlooked aspect is generational transition. Individuals rarely build systems that survive beyond their involvement. Businesses, portfolios, and digital systems often collapse when ownership or management changes. Longevity engineering anticipates succession. Systems are designed with documentation, procedural clarity, automated processes, and participant expectations aligned with continuity rather than individual involvement. The goal is to remove dependency on any single human actor. Psychology is equally important. Participants in a durable system must perceive ongoing value, but their perception alone is insufficient. The system must create structural necessity. When leaving or disengaging would be inconvenient, costly, or disruptive, the participant remains, not because of enthusiasm, but because leaving introduces friction. Friction, when ethically and operationally designed, is a tool for resilience. Redundancy and overlapping loops remain critical. Contracts, behavioral habits, infrastructure dependence, network effects, and legal obligations are not mutually exclusive. The systems that survive longest layer these mechanisms. If one fails, the others maintain stability. Layering does not create inefficiency, it creates robustness. This is the essence of longevity engineering, building income systems that are not merely profitable today, but structurally incapable of rapid failure tomorrow. Chapter 8. Every durable asset requires more than contracts, infrastructure, or reinforcement loops. It requires a psychological moat. A psychological moat is the set of behavioral, habitual, and cognitive structures that make participants reluctant to leave, switch, or disengage. Unlike physical or legal barriers, it operates on perception, routine, and expectation. Systems without it are structurally vulnerable, even if their contracts and infrastructure are sound. The most reliable psychological moat is integration. Participants remain because the system is embedded into their operations, their routines, and their decision-making processes. Integration creates friction for leaving, but it does so subtly. It does not coerce or punish. It becomes invisible, assumed, and habitual. The deeper the integration, the harder it is for participants to consider alternatives. Habits form the core of psychological moats. Systems that become part of daily behavior are no longer optional. Consider financial services, enterprise tools, subscription platforms, or learning systems. Users return automatically because stopping would disrupt their own routine or workflow. Habitual engagement multiplies the effect of other structural mechanisms, reinforcing contracts, infrastructure, and renewal loops. Network effects strengthen psychological moats further. When participation depends on other participants, leaving becomes socially or operationally costly. Communication platforms, marketplaces, and collaborative software gain durability because each participant's exit reduces value for themselves and others, creating an incentive to stay. The more interconnected the user base, the stronger the moat. Trust and predictability also create psychological resilience. Systems that consistently deliver value at expected intervals reduce cognitive friction. Participants do not need to evaluate alternatives constantly because the cost of reevaluation is higher than the benefit. Consistency converts satisfaction into inertia, and inertia into structural advantage. scarcity, and exclusivity can complement integration. When access is limited, difficult to replicate, or tied to reputation, participants value continuity more. Membership systems, licensing frameworks, and specialized services often leverage these principles to reduce churn. Psychological moats are strengthened when participants perceive leaving as a loss, not merely a neutral choice. Effective moats are layered. Habits, network effects, trust, predictability, and exclusivity interact to reinforce one another. If one layer weakens, the others maintain retention. Systems that rely on only a single behavioral factor are vulnerable. For example, a system that relies solely on trust without embedded routines can fail if a competitor offers greater convenience. Moats are also dynamic. They are maintained and strengthened over time rather than created once. Continuous adaptation, participant engagement, and reinforcement of behavioral patterns ensure the moat does not erode. Psychological moats that stagnate lose efficacy, particularly in markets where alternatives proliferate. Participant perception must be aligned with structural mechanisms. Contracts, infrastructure, and loops are ineffective if users do not recognize their value or cost. The psychology of participation converts structural mechanisms into lived experience. If participants feel they could leave without consequence, even a system with multiple renewal loops can lose its stability. The design of psychological moats is not about manipulation. It is about creating alignment between participant behavior, structural pathways, and long-term system objectives. Participants remain not because they are coerced, but because the system is easier to stay in than to leave. Convenience, habit, and integration outweigh external alternatives. Redundant moats are particularly effective. Multiple overlapping behavioral incentives prevent attrition from eroding system durability. Habit formation reinforces network effects. Network effects reinforce perceived exclusivity, and exclusivity reinforces trust and predictability. The interaction creates a system that is psychologically and operationally sticky. Psychological moats also increase the leverage of other system components. Infrastructure, legal pathways, and reinforcement loops perform better when participants are behaviorally resistant to leaving. The combination of structural and psychological durability creates exponential stability over time. In practice, building a psychological moat requires observation, analysis, and iterative design. Systems must be monitored for engagement, habit formation, and perceived value. Weak points in participant behavior must be identified and reinforced. Moats are not static. They are continuously engineered to maintain relevance and resistance. Finally, psychological moats extend the system's lifespan beyond measurable economic loops. They protect against churn, erosion of trust, and voluntary disengagement. They turn structural pathways into assumed participation, making the system resilient to external pressures such as competitors, technological shifts, or minor regulatory changes. Chapter 9. Knowledge and skill are often treated as personal advantages, but they are not assets in themselves. They are inputs. Their economic value depends entirely on how they are converted into systems that generate ongoing independent income. The key to converting intellectual capital into durable assets lies in abstraction, codification, and embedding. Abstraction means separating the unique insight or skill from the individual performing it. Many experts fail because their income is inseparable from their presence. A consultant, coach, or specialist may charge premium fees, but the moment they step away, income stops. Abstraction converts knowledge into principles, processes, and frameworks that can function without constant supervision. It creates independence from the originator. Codification transforms abstracted knowledge into reproducible structures. This can be documented procedures, digital content, software, or training systems. Codification ensures that value is not trapped in the human mind, but is embedded in a tangible system. Systems, unlike people, do not fatigue, negotiate, or forget. They operate continuously. Embedding is the process of integrating these codified systems into workflows, infrastructure, or habitual behavior. The knowledge itself is inert until it interacts with participants in a repeatable, enforced, or self-reinforcing way. Embedded knowledge becomes an active economic system when it is applied, reinforced, and valued by participants independently of the original creator. The conversion of skill into structural assets requires design for scale. Labor-based systems scale linearly. Doubling effort doubles output. System-based assets scale exponentially. Designing one process that serves thousands multiplies impact without increasing dependency on the creator. The structural leverage comes from creating systems that perform the work of the expert at scale. Durable knowledge systems often combine multiple forms of renewal. Contractual pathways secure recurring engagement through subscriptions, licenses, or certifications. Behavioral loops reinforce learning or participation through repeated application and integration into routines. Infrastructure embedding ensures that the system is indispensable to workflows or operations. The combination produces an income source that is independent, renewable, and compounding. Many attempts to monetize expertise fail because they focus on immediate income rather than system design. A seminar, a consulting engagement, or a course may generate revenue, but without ongoing participation and reinforcement, the system decays. True intellectual assets require structures that sustain engagement beyond a single interaction. Intellectual property can accelerate system durability, but it is insufficient on its own. Patents, copyrights, and trademarks create legal barriers, but they do not create participation or habitual use. They support enforcement, but the system must still be operationally embedded. Legal protection amplifies durability, but structural design ensures it. Scalability also depends on modularity. Systems must be divisible, reproducible, and adaptable. Modular components allow for incremental expansion, easier updates, and integration with other systems. Without modularity, knowledge assets risk being brittle, difficult to maintain, replicate, or evolve. Modular design increases lifespan, resilience, and adaptability. Another critical factor is participant integration. Knowledge systems are durable when participants are actively engaged. Passive exposure is insufficient. Systems that require application, decision-making, or repeated interaction embed themselves in participant behavior. This deep engagement increases retention, strengthens renewal loops, and reinforces compounding. Monitoring and feedback are essential. Systems that operate without observation risk silent decay. Usage patterns, retention metrics, engagement depth, and participant outcomes provide insight into system health. Continuous iteration based on these metrics maintains relevance, corrects erosion, and strengthens reinforcement loops. Finally, knowledge systems gain longevity through layering. Multiple channels of reinforcement, behavioral, contractual, infrastructural, network effects, combine to protect the system from decay. Each layer independently increases stability. Together, they produce resilience that far exceeds the sum of its parts. The transformation of skill into an independent asset is not trivial. It requires patience, discipline, and rigorous design thinking. It is a process of converting ephemeral expertise into persistent, self-sustaining economic structures. When done correctly, intellectual capital stops being a measure of personal labor and becomes a generator of structural wealth. This requires integrating all the principles discussed previously: structural leverage, renewal mechanisms, psychological moats, longevity engineering, and the conversion of knowledge into systems, into a coherent, self-reinforcing design. Financial independence is often described as the ability to stop working, but this is a misconception. True independence is not about absence, it is about removing fragility. The system continues because it is engineered to do so, not because the owner is present to maintain it. Effort shifts from active production to strategic oversight, monitoring, and occasional optimization. The system becomes a living structure, capable of adapting without constant intervention. A central concept in the exitless life is that income systems must be self-reinforcing at multiple levels. Revenue, participation, and relevance all need to be embedded into loops that do not require the creator's ongoing input. For example, a platform may generate recurring subscription revenue while simultaneously collecting data that improves usability, increases retention, and strengthens participant dependence. Each cycle compounds structural stability. Diversification remains critical. Even a highly durable system is exposed to risk if it depends on a single market, technology, or demographic. Long-term stability requires multiple overlapping mechanisms for generating and maintaining value. Legal pathways, behavioral reinforcement, network effects, and infrastructural control must be layered so that if one mechanism weakens, others maintain continuity. An exitless system is also designed for evolution. The environment is never static. Markets shift, regulations change, technologies improve, and competitors innovate. Systems that cannot evolve will eventually degrade, regardless of how well they are currently structured. Separation between core function and peripheral implementation allows for continuous adaptation without compromising participation or structural integrity. Modularity, documentation, and procedural clarity enable evolution without disruption. Ownership and control of the pathways through which value flows are essential. Without control, income remains dependent on external systems, exposing the asset to unilateral changes in policy, algorithms, or access. Durable systems position themselves as unavoidable in their operational context, whether through contractual obligations, habitual integration, or infrastructural embedding. Participants continue because exiting introduces cost, friction, or lost value. Monitoring is not optional. Even systems designed for longevity require attention to metrics that reveal structural health. Churn, engagement, reinvestment efficiency, and participation depth provide insight into whether loops remain self-sustaining. Early detection of erosion allows for corrective measures before decay propagates through the system. Strategic oversight becomes a reinforcing activity rather than an emergency response. Time leverage and structural leverage converge in the exitless framework. While time remains a limited and perishable resource, structural leverage allows the system to operate independently. The owner's effort is concentrated on high-value decisions that improve efficiency, expand reach, and strengthen reinforcement loops rather than on routine maintenance. This shift magnifies the impact of limited time and preserves it for strategic growth. Psychological moats remain essential. Participants must perceive continued value, habitual convenience, and operational necessity. Contracts, infrastructure, network effects, and habits work together to create inertia. Longevity engineering ensures that even as external conditions change, participants remain embedded, the system remains functional, and revenue continues to flow. Scalability and adaptability are interconnected. Growth is not measured solely by revenue or reach, but by the system's ability to absorb additional participants without increasing vulnerability. Systems must expand without compromising reinforcement loops, renewal mechanisms, or psychological moats. Each incremental addition should strengthen, not weaken, structural integrity. Intellectual assets play a unique role in exitless systems. Knowledge, skill, and expertise can be converted into self-operating systems through codification, abstraction, and embedding. These assets become independent income generators when participants interact with them without requiring ongoing input from the creator. The system is no longer limited by human labor. It is limited only by its design. The integration of these principles produces a system that is resilient, adaptive, and compounding. Revenue flows persist, participation continues, and relevance is maintained. The owner transitions from being an operator to being a strategist, focusing on optimization, evolution, and reinforcement. Human effort is leveraged, not expended. An exitless life system does not guarantee immortality, but it dramatically extends the effective lifespan of economic activity. It converts ephemeral effort into persistent structures, transforms knowledge into durable systems, and embeds value so deeply that its continuity is largely independent of the creator's presence. The system becomes a self-sustaining engine of economic stability. Ultimately, the objective is not simply wealth accumulation. It is the creation of autonomy, resilience, and control. By building systems that persist, evolve, and self-reinforce, income is no longer tied to personal labor, attention, or risk exposure. This framework allows individuals to focus on strategic growth, innovation, or personal pursuits while the system maintains itself, compounding over time. The framework outlined in this book is a blueprint. Execution requires discipline, strategic foresight, and patient design. It is not a path to instant wealth. It is a path to lasting economic independence, structural durability, and financial systems that endure beyond individual involvement. By applying these principles, anyone can transform temporary labor into persistent assets, creating income systems that, if properly maintained, can sustain themselves indefinitely. This completes the core framework of building income systems designed to persist. Every principle, from structural leverage to psychological moats, longevity engineering, self-compounding loops, and intellectual asset conversion, interlocks to form a coherent methodology. Applied consistently, this approach produces assets capable of generating durable, reliable, and self-reinforcing income streams that outlast active participation. The practical next step is design, testing, and disciplined implementation, translating theory into operational systems, observing structural health, iterating for reinforcement, and gradually converting human-dependent processes into autonomous economic engines. This final step turns understanding into real, enduring wealth.